regime, nobody has the right to forget, because we, as guardians of the rule of law and democracy and of human rights today, we, as the Council of Europe, pay tribute to the millions of lives lost completely unnecessarily through forced hunger, the most barbarian form of suffering. A population which died from hunger progressively, day by day, which makes the events even harder to bear. And it's important that each of us in our respective countries insist that genocide must continue to be part of history. It must not be overlooked. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Simantis. I now call Lord David Blencathra. Lord Blencathra.
Mr. Monis, it's delighted to see you in the chair for this important debate. This is an excellent report by Mr. Abram and very ably presented by my colleague Lord Keane. Of course, Putin denies that the Holodomor ever happened. That's just another Putin lie, just as he says that Ukraine invaded Russia, not the other way around. As this excellent report makes clear, the Soviet Union always claimed that the famine was just an act of God affecting the whole of Russia. But with the collapse of the Soviet regime, we can see from the files and documents released that it was a deliberate initiative by Stalin to kill up to 10 million Ukrainian small farmers, so more an act of Satan than of God. Like all socialist regimes, they wanted state control of the means of production of food. And when Ukrainian farmers objected, then the regime stole all their food, their animals, and even the seed grain. Farmers who had left Ukraine were brought back to empty lands and empty barns and left to starve. And as the report makes clear, and as the documents make clear, between 4 to 10 million Ukrainians were murdered in this way. We should remember it because it was the first socialist Holocaust, with many more to follow, as always happens with socialist regimes. All told, the Soviet socialist regime under Stalin killed 35 million. The National Socialist Workers' Party in Germany of Hitler killed 6 million Jews in the Holocaust and 20 million others in World War II. Communist Party of China, Mao Zedong, killed 65 million. Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot killed another 2 million, and North Korea about 3.5. I wonder, why is it always it's extreme socialist governments which do it? Now, where I do slightly disagree with the report is that it says that Ukraine again faces the threat of genocide. No, the genocide by Putin is already happening. Russia has fired thousands of missiles into civilian housing, shops and schools in Ukraine. Putin is deliberately targeting the civilian people of Ukraine. Now, the definition of genocide is contained in Article 2 of the Convention and describes genocide as a crime committed with the intent to destroy a national, ethnic, racial or religious group in whole or in part. Since 2022, 12,000 civilians have been killed in Ukraine, not as an accident or collateral damage from a military attack, but in a deliberate attempt to kill as many Ukrainian civilians as possible and hope to break their morale. And if Russia wins this war, then Putin will exterminate millions of Ukrainians or disappear them to the far north and east of Russia. Thus, I call on all our governments to recognize the Holodomor as the first Holocaust, not exactly the same as the Holocaust by Hitler against the Jews, but full-on genocide nevertheless. Now that we have the evidence from the official Soviet files, there is cast-iron proof that it was a deliberate genocide masterminded by the socialist regime of Stalin. So let's not let Putin get away with another lie. Let us all confirm in our national parliaments and countries that the Holodomor was genocide, the deliberate killing of Ukrainians. Russia committed genocide against Ukraine 90 years ago, and they've started it again. Let us condemn them for that.
Thank you, Lord Blencathra. I now call Ryan Vogels of ALD Party.
Thank you, Mr. President. This report commemorating the 19th anniversary of the Holodomor in Ukraine gives an important political signal to recognize and remember the cruelty of what happened in 1932 and 1933. Man-made famine by the regime of Stalin led to the death of millions of Ukrainians. It is of the utmost importance to give the victims the recognition they deserve. Today, not only Russia's use of food as a tool of war against Ukraine, but also the abduction of Ukrainian children and the ongoing military attacks echo the horror of the Holodomor. At this moment, around 30 countries recognize the Holodomor as genocide. Genocide is defined in the 1948 Convention on the Prevention of and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Although genocide was not yet recognized as an international crime at the time of the Holodomor, the Dutch Advisory Committee on Public International Law advised that by contemporary standards, the Holodomor could be qualified as genocide, insofar as requirements of the crime genocide are met. And on the basis of this advice, the Dutch House of Representatives adopted a motion with 145 out of 150 votes that the famine in Ukraine in 1932 and 1933, deliberately caused by the Soviet regime, is recognized and condemned as genocide by contemporary standards. For the European liberals, it's important that necessary investigations take place so that perpetrators of crimes against humanity and war crimes can be held accountable. All contracting parties to the Genocide Convention, including member states of the Council of Europe, have a duty to prevent and punish any acts of genocide. It is of the utmost importance to give victims the recognition they deserve. Recognition is necessary to shape a shared future together. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Mr. Sila Andreas Uneland from the UEL party.
Thank you. Thank you, President, and thank the rapporteur. The Holodomor is a dark chapter in human history. This atrocity, which claimed the lives of millions, was not the consequence of natural disaster or poor policy, but a calculated act of terror by the Soviet regime. It was a deliberate assault on the Ukrainian people intended to crush their spirit, erase their identity, and secure domination. The Holodomor was not merely about starvation. It was about control and subjugation, about breaking the backbone of Ukrainian nationhood. 90 years later, Ukraine faces again an attack on their nation. The illegal Russian invasion shows no respect for human lives, and we stand in solidarity and support with the Ukrainian people. As we commemorate the atrocity Holodomor, we must recognize that the use of hunger as a weapon is not a relic of the past. It is a reality that continues to plague our world today. The echoes of Holodomor are not confined to history books. In Gaza, we see how control over food and essential resources has been weaponized. For years, the blockade of Gaza, which restricts the flow of goods, including food and medical supplies, has created a humanitarian crisis where millions are trapped in cycles of poverty, malnutrition, and despair. It is a situation that can only be described as collective punishment aimed at breaking an entire population. Now, a total of 96% of the population of Gaza is facing acute food insecurity. Almost 500,000 of these are in catastrophic conditions, according to the World Food Programme. In July alone, more than 1.4 million people in Gaza did not receive food rations. At the same time, there was enough food for the entire population for 2 months on boards, trucks that are prevented from entering and are stuck at the border. Israel uses hunger as a weapon against the Palestinians. In Sudan, hunger is also used as a tool of war. The deliberate obstruction of humanitarian aid in conflict zone has led to widespread famine and suffering. Armed groups and governments alike have used starvation to weaken their enemies and force population into submission. The tragic reality is that weaponizing of hunger remains a powerful and devastating tool. It is a strategy that preys on the vulnerable, the marginalized, and the voiceless. It is a crime that transcends borders, from the fields of Ukraine in the 1930s to the besieged cities of Gaza and the war-torn regions of Sudan today. We must hold account those who use starvation as a means of war and oppression. We must demand that governments and armed groups respect the fundamental rights to food and aid, even in times of conflict. As we remember the victims of the Holodomor and bear witness to the suffering in Gaza and Sudan, let us commit ourselves to action. We must advocate for stronger international mechanisms to monitor and respond to the use of hunger as a weapon. We must support humanitarian efforts to reach those in need, and we must speak out, loud and clear, against any regime or group that would use starvation as a weapon. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I now call Ms. Mia Petra Kumpula-Natari from the SOC party.
Mr. President, dear colleagues, clear blue sky above the yellow grain field, those are the colors of the Ukrainian flag. And this is a story of Ukrainian grain. In 1932 and 33, the Great Famine of Ukraine, known as Holodomor, claims the lives of estimated at least 4 million people. Holodomor in English is death by hunger. The Great Famine was intentional and targeted. 1932, the Kremlin decided how much grain would be obtained and exported from Ukraine. Stalin dismissed all concerns regarding the impossibility of meeting the targets, and any dissenting voices were muted. In this resolution, this assembly recognized the Holodomor of 1932 and 33, a genocide against Ukrainian people. Ukraine was hit a catastrophic extent. The borders were sealed to prevent the victims from leaving, which alone serves as a proof of intent to deliberately starve the victims. While Ukrainians continued to die for starvation, the USSR proceeded to ship millions of tons of Ukrainian grain to Moscow and abroad in hopes of securing more international influence. The leadership was acutely aware of the situation on the ground, yet chose not to help the starving. Dear colleagues, we are here to commemorate the millions of victims of Holodomor 92 years ago. I would love to stand here to say never again, but we are not there yet. We keep in our thoughts on men and women in frontline fighting for Ukraine with this very moment. Furthermore, we are here to testify the atrocities of Putin's regime today. Today, grain is once again a weapon. Russia has hit grain farms, fields and warehouses, and as well as port through which the grains has been transported to the world. There are mines on the fields and so on. The story of grain is once again about politics as much as it's about the hunger, where wheat has become a weapon that destabilizes the entire world economy and with which Russia tries to blind its allies to sphere of the influence. We see Russian army deliberately attacking the civilian infrastructure and energy systems in Ukraine. Millions of households have lost power without warning. 50, or some estimates say even 80% of the Ukraine power generation capacity has been either occupied, destroyed, or damaged. The upcoming winter presents a profound risk of an even deeper shortfall of energy supply. Dear colleagues, please, when you travel back home, remind your governments and energy sector actors the possibility to donate parts for the energy system and generators today, not 90 years ago, today. We, the international community, needs to see today and act accordingly. We parliamentarians here call all governments to do their utmost to help people in Ukraine to fight off ongoing genocidal assaults against their nation. And I urge that all of us not to let Russia destroy the future of the nation utmost efforts needs to be done to help the children of the nation. Deportation of children must stop, and children deported needs to be brought back. In this report, we call ICC prosecutor to examine these crimes. We acknowledge we depend on each other and we stand with Ukraine together today. I quote, "War shows you that individualism is an illusion. When human connection disrupt, you realize how much you depend on them," said Ukrainian philosopher Volodymyr Yermolenko. Slava Ukraini.
Thank you. I now call Miss Anna Christina Mikkonen.
Merci.
Thank you, President. Dear colleagues, several countries and the European Parliament have recognized the Holodomor as genocide in Ukraine and as being part of the efforts of the Soviet Union to wipe out Ukraine as a cultural and ethnic entity between 1932 and 1933. Recognition of the Holodomor, an artificial famine, as genocide was broadly raised in the discussions on the 90th anniversary of the Holodomor in the midst of war and after Russia's withdrawal from the Black Sea Grain Agreement. The United Nations Secretary General declared that millions of starving people are suffering because of Russia's actions. Under the yoke of Russia's illegal war of aggression, Ukraine is fighting once more for its very existence. The political and cultural elites are persecuted, and cultural heritage is systematically destroyed. In a time of war, the highest price is always paid by the most vulnerable, notably children. Forcible transfer of Ukrainian civilians, of Ukrainian children, and their illegal adoption in Russia are particularly shocking. The number of children deported and forcibly displaced now has risen to 19,546. This figure is incomprehensible. The fate of forcibly displaced children in Ukraine can also be described as genocide in nature. Russia must be held responsible for its war crimes. This barbaric war waged by Russia infringes international law. Ukraine deserves a just and lasting peace based on international law in respect of the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Finland will remain resolute in its support. Thank you very much for your attention, Slava Ukraina.
Thank you. I now call Ms. Yasko of the Ukraine.
Dear colleagues, I want to tell you thank you for each of you who are giving a speech now about Holodomor. I'm going to say thank you for the rapporteur, for the current chair, who are presenting this. So many years Ukrainians were waiting until Holodomor would be recognized as genocide. You know, at that times in the 30s, during the Stalin times, it was such a dramatic time. My grandmother used to be telling to my mother that during the Holodomor, she would go to her work, seeing some people on the street waiting for something, and in a few hours later, when she would be going back, these people would be already dead, lying on the street because they didn't have food. And I want to ask actually here one question. why the world was silent about that. Was at that time there was no information that there was a famine, or what was actually happening? The fact was that there were reports, and there were countries, there were embassies that were present in Ukraine from different countries that were reporting to their capitals. But what was happening? According to the archives, for instance, there was Italian diplomats who were reporting to Italy at that time. But at the time, there was Mussolini in Italy. So Italian authorities actually said, we're not going to talk about that. The same was happening in Germany. There were reports coming to Germany. Was United States vocal about that? Unfortunately, no. And there was one journalist that you may be aware of, a British journalist, his name is Gareth Jones, who traveled to Ukraine, and he reported that there was a real famine, and when he was traveling, the people were screaming and saying, please say it to all the world, we don't have bread. What happened to him? He was killed after some years by, there are different versions, but NKVD probably killed him. So that was the moment when actually the truth that was so uncomfortable for so many countries, but there was no will to recognize this truth. And I'm calling this assembly that we talk about such things for the historical truth that is so important. You know, in Ukraine, you still have many families that will be telling to their children, please, don't leave your food. Always finish the food on your plate. The same would be happening with a piece of bread. If you have a piece of bread and you didn't finish eating it, never throw it to the trash bin. For us, this is something that is very deep in our genetical DNA. And everything that is connected to the grain and to the bread is very important. I'm asking this assembly, please, let's make sure that such terrible disinformation or silence about certain truths in history are not silenced for years. We're working on it, and never again. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jasko, for an excellent speech. I now call Mr. Marcus Wiechel of the ECDA of Sweden.
Mr. President, I am most grateful to our rapporteur, Mr. Abraham, for having prepared such a clearly written and factual report on one of the worst crimes on our continent committed in the last century, namely the deliberate starving to death of an estimated 10 million Ukrainians in the early 1930s. For 2 years in a row, the harvest in Ukraine was confiscated by Stalin's henchmen, and then either destroyed or taken to other parts of the Soviet Union. Not even the seeds foreseen for the following year's harvest were spared. The purpose was undoubtedly to wipe Ukraine, its people, and its rich civilization entirely off the map, especially since Stalin's hunger campaign was accompanied by the elimination of Ukraine's cultural and political elites in the cities. And now, as the rapporteur's report rightly points out, we have sort of a tragic repeat of this horror, in the form of Russian bombs falling off the sky, killing thousands of Ukrainian civilians and leveling entire cities with the ground. Not to mention trying to take out the country's whole heating and energy network as winter approaches, with its long spells of polar cold. This is something that we in the free parts of Europe must do our utmost to forestall, so that the Holodomor of the 1930s is not followed these next few months by an also murderous Holocaust. Finally, dear friends and colleagues, I fully agree with the rapporteur's recommendation that we call the Holodomor for what it was, that is, attempted genocide. This is an issue that I've raised for many years in my own parliament, And I hope that many of you distinguished friends and colleagues will do the same in your respective parliaments. And that we now vow to do everything that we can to try to ensure that this will never happen again. Slava Ukraini. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now call Ms. Kravishuk of the Ukraine.
Dear colleagues, dear Chairman of the committee, I would like to thank for this report and for this debate. And I would like to share my story. 15 years ago, I was a young journalist working in documentary about Holodomor. At that time, we were able to film probably the last witnesses of this greatest tragedy of Ukrainian people. They were kids at the time, and their parents were deprived of everything in 1930s. I was filming these interviews during the day, and when I was going back to the hotel room, I was crying half of the night. I could not understand how the world could just be so silent when millions of people were dying in the most famous country, most famous land with a very rich soil, and that was named as the grain basket of Europe. Indeed, the diplomats were reporting, and in this film we actually found these documents, and diplomats of different embassies that were in Ukraine, they read these documents in Italian, in Polish, in German, and we did go to Aberystwyth, Wales, and film the diaries of Gareth Jones, the American journalist. And you know what happened to him? He was blamed by Walter Duranty, another journalist in the United States, that he was, Gareth Jones was British. Duranty blamed him to be lying to the world. And at the same time, Ukrainians that lived in other countries called as a diasporas to help those who lived in Soviet Ukraine. My family comes from western part, it was Poland at the time. They didn't experience it, but we did found the testimonies that Ukrainians were trying, from Polish side, were trying to give grain, and Soviet soldiers were putting this grain into the river that was a natural border between the countries, saying there is no hunger. And you know what? The unpunished evil always returns. And it returns right now with the genocide that Ukrainians are experiencing right now. And the grandsons, great-grandsons of those who were coming to Ukrainian houses and taking out the grain, now they're coming to Ukrainian houses to kill, to rape, and to occupy. And now Ukraine has a voice. Now Ukraine has members of parliament here speaking. Now Ukraine has a state, we have an army, and we are fighting back. And that is the difference right now. And we have the support of you right now. And thank you for all the resolutions that were passed in your parliaments saying that Holodomor was a genocide of Ukrainian people. Because the truth has to win, and at the end of the day, the justice must prevail. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. I now call Mrs. Maria Metsvenka-Fedorenko of the Ukraine. Maria.
Hello, colleagues. Thank you for this extremely important debate, and I see a lot of youth representatives here, which might hear the word Holodomor for the first time in their life. And I would like to explain why this historical document is so important, and why it is linked to Austria, Britain, and my home city, Kharkiv, which was yesterday heavily bombarded by the Russian missiles, and many people were wounded, including a 3-year-old child. So, colleagues, in 1933, Austrian engineer Alexander Wienerberger has arrived to Kharkiv very, very randomly. He was not going there on purpose. And he has taken first photographs of Holodomor ever taken on the planet Earth. He was having very extended diplomatic links, which gave him an opportunity to share these photographs. So the world find out for the first time in 1933 that a famine, that deprivation from the right from food, from the right from eating what you grow on the fields and at home exists. Imagine in 2022, when Russia relaunched the war and started full-scale aggression on us, his granddaughter, British photographer Samara Pierce, after 90 years, arrived to Kharkiv. She took a picture in the places where civilians were bombarded, where many people died, many children died, many people lost everything they were working for all their life because of the crime of aggression of Russia. And Samara has become a main lady from the movie called Family Album. I'm sure it will receive all the possible awards in film festivals, and I highly recommend to show it. But what it brings to our understanding is that the crime of genocide, which we called in previous resolution possible genocide, maybe a genocide, and now it clearly states that what Stalin has been doing to us, deliberately depriving from grain, my grandparents, the grandparents of my colleagues and all Ukrainians, was a deliberate act of genocide, which is continuing up until today. And I think, colleagues, this text clearly shows, and it calls to take all the perpetrators to justice, those who plan, order to commit these crimes. Therefore, we think there can be more ICC orders, because on daily basis, civilians, not military, but civilians are deliberately targeted. You may say it's not linked, but now I have to mention the amendment of Eric Cross from Estonian delegation. And just a year ago, we became first international institution to call that it's legitimate to target Russian territory, the oil refineries, the places where Russian airplanes are starting to bombard my home city, Kharkiv, and many other places in Ukraine where people are peacefully sleeping. Dear youth, our students and children can't study. In my city, Kharkiv, children are studying in metro schools, underground, because anytime a rocket can kill them. So they're deprived not only from food sometimes, but also for the right from education, for the right to peaceful living, for all the rights which are enshrined in European Convention for Human Rights. Please, colleagues, if you haven't done so, pass same resolutions in the national parliaments. Let's call for ICC to issue extra warrants, extra sanctions, long-range decision for Ukrainian army to defend Europe yet again. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. And now I call Ms. Nadia Ardonova from Bulgaria.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dear colleagues, Holodomor means hunger meant to inflict death. These are the semantics of our universally recognized historical term. The very name of the massive starvation cries out that the famine was intentionally brought upon its victims. The Holodomor in the 1930s was methodically planned and executed by the Soviet regime. As Ukrainian farmers were starving to death, the authorities confiscated more than 4 million tons of grain, an amount which would have been enough to feed 12 million people per year. Millions of Ukrainians died because of that despicable, horrendous crime. Children, men, women. Among them, there were at least 100,000 ethnic Bulgarians. They were killed in one of the most despicable crimes of the 20th century. Yet again, the horrors of the totalitarian regime set a pattern. Horror repeated just 14 years later. Similarly intentional policies of the Stalin regime led to the same terror famine in Soviet Ukraine in 1946-1947. One ethnic Bulgarian having survived that period as a little kid tells a story of cannibalism, mass graves, and entire families being wiped out after the Stalinist state taken away their grain at gunpoint. And I agree with our esteemed colleague Evgenia that unpunished evil returns again. Now, in the 20th century, Ukrainian people are facing horror again. Long before the full-scale invasion on 24th of February 2022, Putin officials have openly portrayed Ukrainians as Russians while rejecting their nation-state as a mere historical part of Russia. In the past month, Putin has been fighting a war of systematic terror with an emphasis on a scorched earth military strategy, making it impossible for Ukrainians to live in their land. Today, in these tremendously trying times, it is our duty to remember the crimes against the people of Ukraine and to help them to fight off the ongoing genocidal assault against their nation. On 1st of February 2023, the Bulgarian parliament recognized Holodomor as a genocide against Ukraine and designated each last Saturday of November as a day for commemorating the victims of Holodomor. I am proud that I was one of those 134 Bulgarian parliamentarians who supported this decision, because we should never forget. Commemorating the 19th anniversary of the Holodomor comes with the moral imperative for all of us to help the Ukrainian people protect themselves from Putin's genocidal campaign by all and any means possible. The horror, the genocide must be stopped now. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Mr. Roslav Tisyk from the Ukraine.
Dear Chairman, dear colleagues, dear reporter, dear youth, today we commemorate the 19th anniversary of one of the most tragic pages in the history of the Ukrainian people, the Holodomor of 1932-33, which was deliberately organized by the Soviet regime with the aim of destroying the Ukrainian nation. For Ukraine, the topic of Holodomor is very painful, because it's not just a page of history, but a national tragedy, the consequences of which we still feel. And even today there are living witnesses of this terrible crime who survived the horrors of artificial hunger and saw the deaths of their relatives and friends. After the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, we are once again faced with the reality of the horrors of past. The actions of the Russian army in the occupied territories, the mass murders in Bucha and Irpin, and the use of prohibited weapons and the forced deportation of Ukrainian children are all part of the same policy of destroying the Ukrainian nation. Russia wipes off Ukrainian cities and villages in the war zone from the face of the earth. Such places as Mariupol, Bakhmut, Popasna, Mariinka, Kremina, and many others have become symbols of barbarism, with destroying buildings and living of millions of people. Thousands of families were left without homes. Entire families were destroyed. And now only ruins are left there. And next to the living witnesses of the Holodomor, there are hundreds of thousands of witnesses of the terrible crimes of the Russian occupiers. These people can tell firsthand about the cruelty and atrocity they encountered in the 21st century. Ukraine has once again become a victim of criminal aggression, and the world is once again witnessing new attempts to destroy our national identity. Russian propaganda openly denies the existence of the Ukrainian people as an independent nation. Perhaps the world should think about whether it's time to overthrow the empire that has continued to wreak chaos, war, and suffering for over a century. Perhaps the fragmentation of its territory into small, safe countries would be a guarantee of peace not only for Ukraine, but also for the whole world. We call on the international community to use all available mechanisms to counter this terrible development. Countries that have signed the Convention on the Prevention of Genocide must take decisive measures to prevent further crimes against the Ukrainian people. And today, while the memory of Holodomor victims, we cannot remain silent about modern streets. Ukraine is once again facing the reality of genocide, and the world has no right to remain aloof. Thank you for your attention. Slava Ukraini!
Thank you. I now call Mr. Emanuel Zingris from Lithuania. He's not here. I shall now call Mr. Helensky Gomchinkaro, Ukraine.
Dear Chairman, dear colleagues, first of all, I would like to thank Knut Abraham, rapporteur on this very important issue. Unfortunately, Knut is not today with us. Today is the day of national unity of Germany. My congratulations to all our German friends. And it's a pity that he is not here presenting his very valuable report. And maybe people who are listening to us now in translation, or those young people who are watching us, they're thinking, why these people are speaking about history? Yeah, what was in 1930s? It's important, but it was many years ago, almost 100 years ago. Maybe they are just crazy, some people speaking about some old stuff. There was no, at that time, YouTube in the world, and that was another world at that time, right? What we're speaking about? We're speaking about what had happened that time, because it happened again now, and it's happening right now. Russia is again committing genocide against Ukrainians. And that is very important to understand. But what had happened 2 years ago when Russia again started full-scale invasion, 10 years ago when they started the war against Ukraine. It's not something new. It's the pattern. They continue for a long time. And like it was 100 years ago in 1930s, do you know who was the winner of Pulitzer Prize in 1932? Duranty. He was the head of New York Times, the chief correspondent of New York Times in Moscow. And he was saying, nobody is starving in Ukraine. Nobody is starving. Soviet Russia is great. They're making industrialization. Oh, New York Times. New York Times. And the same is happening right now when you can hear a lot of Russian propaganda all around you saying, oh no, Russia has the right to attack Ukraine. Oh, it's not just so simple. It's not just that Russia is crazy dictatorship and barbarians who are killing people. They are crazy barbarians. They did it 100 years ago. They're doing this now. But they're interested not just in Ukraine. That's important. When we're speaking about Holodomor, I want to raise your attention that Russia wants to use the food as a leverage against all of you. First of all, against poor countries, against Africa, against Asia, against Middle East, in order for them to suffer, to put as much chaos in the world as possible, in order to make new waves of migrants who will run away from starvation here in Europe or in other places. That's their aim. And that's why they are attacking Ukraine. That's why they are so interested in Odessa, my native city, the biggest city on the Black Sea shore, the biggest city, period, not just in Ukraine, the biggest harbors of the Black Sea. One of the biggest agricultural harbors of the world. Ukraine is feeding 400 million people in the world. It's not my estimation, it's United Nations estimations. Just imagine 400 million people. And 80% of this is coming through the ports of Odessa. That's why Russia is blocking the ports of Odessa from the first day of full-scale invasion. Attacking, missile attacks. They're doing everything they can to make people suffer and starve throughout the whole planet. That's their plan. They want to occupy Odessa. They want to occupy southern Ukraine, to increase their control over the world food. Because today Russia is one of the big exporters. They want to become #1. And that's what they're doing. And we need to stop it. And we need to speak about food security. We need to protect Black Sea. We need to protect Odessa. We need immediately air defense and everything else. This year we started Black Sea Security Forum in Ukraine, in my native Odessa. Next year will be next one, in the end of May. I want to invite all of you who are interested, come to Odessa. Watch yourself the port, which is feeding 400 million people in the world. Understand how important it is to support us today. And together we can stop starvation in the world, we can prevent it, and we can stop this awful Russian empire. And Holodomor should never happen again, not in Ukraine, not in other places of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Oleski. I now call Ms. Regina Bastos from Portugal.
Thank you, Chair. This report is a warning to us all and appeal to those who have shown contempt for human rights. I want to express my gratitude to the rapporteur and Lord Richard Keane for this. History repeats itself. What happened to the Ukrainian people in the 30s and became known as Holodomor could happen again. Holodomor, an artificial famine caused by Soviet authorities that ended up causing the deaths of many millions of Ukrainians. Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine and the war that lasts 2 years and 6 months are today a real risk of repeating some practices against Ukrainian population. We strongly condemned the invasion of Ukraine and the war that lasts. We strongly condemn this war of aggression unleashed by Putin's regime against Ukraine. For us it's clear that the people of Ukraine are fighting for the survival of democracy and freedom and for the future of us all. And that is why we should all be deeply grateful. The Portuguese Parliament approved 7 years ago a vote recognizing Holodomor as a genocide, highlighting that it was planned in a cruel way by the Soviet communist regime, and also expressed its solidarity with the Ukrainian people and condemned all forms of totalitarianism and all types of violations and crimes against humanity, such as those that occurred in 1930s in Ukraine. It is immoral and unacceptable that ongoing war is creating a global food crisis, with Russia destroying and looting Ukraine's grain warehouses and continuing to hinder the export of Ukrainian grain to the countries most in need. We cannot relent or relax our support for the Ukrainian people fighting to defend their country from Russian invaders. As such, we all have an obligation to prevent a Holodomor from occurring again. We will only succeed if we act together and in solidarity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. I now call Ms. Lisa Vasilenko of the Ukraine.
Thank you, President, and thank you to our rapporteur, Knut Abraham, who is not with us today, but he has brought back the topic of Holodomor to this assembly, and he has reinstated historic justice by calling the Holodomor what it really is, the crime of crimes, the crime of genocide that has been committed by Russian leadership against the Ukrainian people in the 1930s. The Holodomor was just that, the crime of crimes. It was a man-made famine against the people of Ukraine by Russian leadership, which was systemically induced, which was artificial, and which was directed at millions of people from one ethnic group, the Ukrainians. From that starvation, between 7 and 10 million Ukrainians have died. Every single family to this day in Ukraine can still recount stories of the Holodomor. And the details of the stories, the atrocities that were happening in those days, they can only be matched by the stories and witnesses that you heard yesterday from
the families of our prisoners of war and of all those Ukrainians that returned from Russian prisons, Russian concentration camps, and the territories that Russia occupies today in Ukraine. The inhumanity of the Russian regime continues because it has been allowed to continue. You have heard from my colleagues previously that history tells us that the international community knew exactly what was going on in Ukraine in the 1930s and also knew who was responsible for it. The same today. We know exactly that Russia is the aggressor state. We know exactly that Russia is committing crime after crime on a daily basis by bombing our cities, by stealing our children, by eradicating the Ukrainian people. This is the goal that Russia is allowed to pursue. Why? Because Russia went unpunished. The crime of 1932-1933, Holodomor, the man-made famine, was never punished. That crime, Russia has done every single thing it could do to make sure that it was never designated, defined as the genocide. And because the international community, only 30 countries or so today recognize the Holodomor as a genocide, because there's no unity around it, there was no accountability of the Russian leadership. There was no responsibility by the Russian leadership. What this means today is that a green light was perceived by the new Russian leadership that they can go on doing crime after crime without being punished. And this is exactly what they are doing. Closing eyes, averting eyes from injustices means more injustices in this world. And today it is our responsibility, based on this report, based on the recommendations of this report, to make sure that every single country, member state of the PACE, but also beyond, recognizes the Holodomor as the genocide of the Ukrainian people. Only by restoring historic justice can we make sure that justice goes on in this world and that no more injustices are repeated. All we can do and all we must do is bring an end to crimes, atrocities, and injustices. And this can be done only by unified solidarity from all of us. Russia continues to use food as a weapon of war, to use grain as a weapon of war. By not allowing exports of grain from Ukraine, by blocking the seas and the maritime routes, Russia is today depriving nations in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East of the crucial grain, not the crucial food that they need. And they already have famines going on there. So history is repeating itself. Let's make sure that the words "never again," which sound very many times in this room today, really start to mean something. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I now call Ms. Irina Konstankiewicz of the Ukraine.
And colleagues, I would like to thank for this report and comprehensive analysis the Holodomor in Ukraine as genocide. Despite almost 100 years that separate us from those tragic events when up to 7 million Ukrainians were starved, this issue has become relevant anyway. Russia's full-scale aggression against Ukraine is a direct continuation of the genocide and component of Russia's imperial policy for 300 years. The nation issue has always been the main topic with social, political, and religious persecution. The whole 20th century and nowadays, Ukrainians as a nation have been subject to various forms of persecution, destruction, and assimilation by Russian regimes of Tsar, Stalin, Putin, and other rulers of Russia. Nothing has changed for the last 100 years. Only the names of the rulers of Russia have changed, but the genocide against Ukrainians is unchanged. The famous writer and artist Volodymyr Vinnychenko once said, "Russia's democracy ends where the Ukrainian issue begins." I have moral authority to say that today, as a descendant of the family on my mother's side, 70% of whom died of hunger. I have the right to say, as a university professor who lectures a course of Ukrainian literature of the 20th century. The 20 years were the revival of Ukrainian literature, theater, cinema, painting, education, science, and journalism. However, all those creators of Ukrainian culture and sciences were tortured in camps and physically destroyed later on. The Renaissance of Ukraine and Ukrainians became the exhausted Renaissance. This is term of the Polish publicist and politician Jerzy Giedroyc. We don't want the history of 20th century to happen again. We don't want the citizens of Ukraine to suffer genocide simply because they are Ukrainians. I call on you to support the Speaker's appeal to all nation parliaments regarding to recognizing of the Holodomor as a genocide of the Ukrainian people. Name the perpetrators and recommended the prosecution and the International Criminal Court. Thank you. Slava Ukraini.
Thank you, ma'am. I now call Mr. Jean-Philippe Libicki. Sir, can you please make sure your card is in the slot?
Mr. Chair, dear colleagues, first I would like to thank Knut Abraham and Lord Keane very much for this very important and even shocking report. In this report, we are actually talking about two events, about the great fame which took place 90 years ago in Ukraine and which we commemorate, and we commemorate up to 10 million died Ukrainian citizens. We commemorate not only the victims, we also recall this, one could say, satanic plan of Stalinist regime, as a result of which millions of inhabitants of a country that under normal conditions could feed the inhabitants of all of Europe died on hunger. And this is the first part of this report. The second part talks about the unprecedented, brutal Russian aggression against Ukraine, as a result of which thousands are killed, thousands lose their homes, and hundreds of children are abducted, and thousands of injured people will never regain their former fitness and will need support. But the key element of this report is to point out that also these two events are separated by 90 years. They have one fundamental issue in common. What they have in common is the belief of the authorities of former Soviet Russia and now the Russian Federation that Ukrainians have no right to independence, to their country. So both of these events are connected by Russian imperial thinking, which leads to denying neighbor countries the right to independence and self-determination. And that for Russia, despite the hope expressed here by Vladimir Karamurza, nothing has changed in this matter. This is the essence of Russian imperialism that must be constantly pointed out. And Knut Abraham and Lord King's report clearly indicates this. That's why it's so important and valuable. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Libicki. I now call Mr. Serhiy Sobolev of the Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I want to thank the author of this report that opens the terrible shadow pictures and pages of world history and especially of Ukrainian history. Everybody knows about the atrocities of 100 deaths of the beginning of 20s. It's a lot of literature about this, and it was really 100 deaths all over the only forming new Russian Empire. But nobody knows that in Hoover Library and Hoover Archive, the biggest archive of Soviet period, it's a lot of pages that the only places where it was prohibited in the beginning of 20s to go for Americans and European expeditions that helped to survive millions and millions of people, it was a territory of Ukraine and Kuban, where Ukrainians are living this time. It's very important to understand why in this report you can find such places as Kuban, Kursk, of course Ukraine, the northern Kazakhstan. Somebody asked, it's not the ethnocide. It was again the hungry death, Holodomor of all peoples of Soviet Russia. But the most important, if you will identify these places, you will see that it's a places where mostly from 70 to 90% were Ukrainian population. In northern Kazakhstan, in Kuban, in Kursk, and of course at the territory of Ukraine. So it was ethnocide that was organized by new formed Russian Empire after Tsar Empire. It's important to understand that the figures from 4 to 10 million dead people, it's impossible now to identify because everything was closed. It was impossible to the representatives of international community even to go to these places. Even the beginning of 20s, it was possible to enter the Soviet Union and to help. And we know about this help from the United States and Europe. At this period, all these zones were closed. And everybody knows that this fact was closed for a long, long period of time. And author of this report opened these horrible pages of world history and gave us new possibility to analyze how Russia organized the killing of million Ukrainians for a long period of time. When again they organized this at the beginning of 2022, we can understand that it was a period of prosperity of Ukraine, when we can export millions and millions of tons of grains to all over the world. So it was impossible to organize Holodomor against Ukraine. So they organized the open aggression first in 2014 and then in 22. And we can see how it's the same methods of Russia. When they are bombing Odessa and other ports in order to organize again Holodomor in Ukraine, and not only in Ukraine, but all over the world, especially in Africa and Asia. So I think that this report is very important to find a real pages of world history and to punish Putin and his regime for these all atrocities, as well as with the regime of Stalin, Tsar regime, and all others. Thank you.
Thank you, Sari. I now call Ms. Lisa Zabirania of the Ukraine.
Dear Chairman, dear Rapporteur, we highly appreciate that now we have the possibility to discuss such important question, and it's not important question only for Ukraine, but for all the world. And actually, what is the biggest mistake of the world, maybe now for all democracy world, is that we doesn't learn from our mistakes in the past. In the beginning of the 20th century, in the center of Europe, we had a really awful tragedy. We had special men made famine, Holodomor. I have the honor to represent Ukrainian delegation, and I would like to say you that each of us has its own personal story. And I also would like to tell you about my family story. My grandmother, she was born in the central part of Ukraine. This is the region which is the most rich for the wheat production. But actually, when the Holodomor was started in Ukraine, she was 2 years old girl. She was very interesting, funny girl. She played, she ran, but in one time she stopped to do it because she was hungry. And in 4 years old, she started to learn to walk again. Please imagine, in 4 years old, she started to walk again. And what we have now? We have now the same situation. It's not about only Ukraine, but if we talk about our country, you know that Ukraine is a really breadbasket of Europe, and not only of Europe, but for all the world. And despite of the war in our country, in 2022, our president started a big initiative for all the world, the special initiative Grain from Ukraine. But since the beginning of the Russian invasion, Ukrainian exports of grain have been severely disrupted. And if we talk about the figures, I would like to say that over 50% of 15 African countries' imports of wheat came from Ukraine. So if we talk about Holodomor, about hunger in the world, we have it now, right now, because of the Russian activity, because of the Russian aggression policy. Our national memory has always been and should continue being a source of strength and resilience. Empowered by the spirits of past, we are guided on our way of fighting for identity and freedom. It's high time to stand in solidarity with Ukraine, to reaffirm commitment to combating dictatorship, tyranny, human rights. Today we have a complicated task to preserve the memory of those who suffered and ensure that their stories are not forgotten. Do everything possible to save as many stories of today as possible. The horrors of Holodomor and realities of our today's remind us about the price of freedom that we pay for the chance to have a country, state, national, and soul. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. I now call Ms. Boriana Aberg from Sweden.
Mr. President, dear colleagues, Holodomor, from the Ukrainian words for famine and death, is the name of the catastrophic famine in Ukraine from 1932 to 1933, a tragedy that has not received the recognition it deserves. A terrible famine disaster where 20 people died every minute, 1,200 lives were extinguished every hour, 28,000 died every day, totaling 10 million people. Holodomor is the Holocaust of famine, orchestrated by the barbaric Soviet communist regime. In true communist fashion, where promises of freedom and prosperity always end in oppression, hunger, and murder. Mass starvation has never occurred in democratic countries, only under dictatorships like the Soviet Union, China, Cambodia, North Korea. In Ukraine, This mass starvation was a direct result of the forced collectivization of farmers and Stalin's goal to crush the Ukrainian people. Everything was confiscated: livestock, grain, flour. Hiding food was punishable by death. Stalin used the skeletal hand of famine to force Ukrainians into the kolkhoz. While people starved, Soviet propaganda blamed Ukrainian farmers for the crisis. The famine in Europe's breadbasket was described as sabotage orchestrated by Ukrainian nationalists in their struggle to break away from the Soviet Union. Do you recognize the rhetoric, dear colleagues? Do you see how history repeats itself? Just as Stalin did, Putin is now committing genocide against the Ukrainians, bombing kindergartens and hospitals, abducting children and executing civilians. What we are witnessing today is another ethnic and political genocide. Putin seeks to destroy Ukraine, driven by his fear of Ukrainian democracy and independence, which threaten his autocratic regime. In November 2003, ahead of the 70th anniversary of Holodomor, Ukraine urged the United Nations to recognize it as a genocide committed by the Soviet regime. Russia vetoed it. Today, in this assembly, we must acknowledge Holodomor as an act of genocide against the Ukrainian people. And we must do everything in our power to help Ukraine fight off this ongoing genocidal assault. We must punish the war criminals, create mechanisms for compensations, and rebuild Ukraine. Slava Ukraini!
Thank you for that impassioned speech. I now call Mr. Dmytro Natalyuka from the Ukraine.
Dear President, thank you very much, dear colleagues, for this report, to Knut Abraham, to Lord Keane. It's a report that reminds us that there has been no repentance throughout history for all the crimes committed by Russia, Russian Empire, the USSR, whatever it was called. Throughout history, what matters is that the spirit stays the same, an imperial, colonial spirit. An autocratic spirit, a spirit that was driven by destruction, by death. And the Holodomor literally means to exterminate by famine. And one might think, what is wrong with those guys? I mean, with Russians and the Ukrainians. They have a war now, and they used to have this Holodomor back in the 20s. How come it's still happening? Some of you might heard it for the first time, especially our honored guest here. Some of you might know it, but this is precisely the consequence of the imperial policy that Russia keeps on applicating in the territory of Ukraine. You see, the problem is the difference between the Eastern imperialism and the Western imperialism, used to be, thanks God. Western imperialism was all about not providing the opportunity to reach up to the titular nation of the empire. Russian imperialism is very different. The essence of Russian imperialism is that if you think that you are not Russian, then you are a deviation. and they should exterminate you. You should be either Russian or you should be wanting to become one. There is no other option. This is the only way. That is why Russia has been historically exterminating other nations' cultures, languages, history, religion, because the Russians think that other countries are a deviation. And which countries do not belong to Russia? The former emperor of Russia, Alexander III, said, literally, Russia never ends anywhere. Anywhere. This is the position. So it means, for the moment, those who are suffering are the countries that Russia can physically reach. But it has no intention to end there. And it will be considering a deviation any further nation, any further population that will be within its reach. And it will be weaponizing everything it can to exterminate those populations. Children, hunger, they will be weaponizing food. They could have been weaponized even the air if they invented how to do it. And this is the real tragedy, because throughout all these years, throughout all these centuries of gory, brutal imperialism, there never ever has been any repentance. And the absence of this repentance by Russia, by the Russians, and by the government of Russia is the direct consequence of the war we're seeing today. And I'm so thankful for bringing up this topic of Holodomor, which is incredibly crucial, but it symbolizes that we still need the Russians to repent, to turn this page, and then basically leave this story in the history, however sad it might be. But the repentance should come, and this resolution is there to remind the people about the necessity to stop this evil, to stop this imperialism, and to make Russians repent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now call Ms. Marianne Binderkeller from Switzerland.
Dear Chair, dear colleagues, I allow myself to speak in my mother tongue, German. Und danke für
Thank you for this report. It shows the merciless nature of the Stalinist dictatorship and the diabolical plan. A plan to eliminate a nation, and to do so it creates a famine. The pillars of society are destroyed. You've read the report. I don't need to summarize it. But at a time of fast increasing amnesia of history, at a time in which personal opinions and ideology are privileged over facts, in a time in which propaganda lies are softening people's minds, this report is essential. It sets out history and does not allow us to evade its reality. This report shows the mechanisms of dictatorships and the terror regime. In Stalin's time, in the Third Reich, and today, where any fundamentalist religious groups are in charge, the mullahs, the Hamas, the Hezbollahs, whatever. I am a child of the Cold War. Europe was separated by a wall. Today is the day in which we remember this. Whoever wanted to evade the dictatorship was shot at the wall. I'll never understand how in the western part of Europe voices can still be heard which parrot the words of the last descendant and henchman of the communist dictatorship, a KGB spy. Because in the Ukraine, precisely those values are in jeopardy which we in the West expect for ourselves as a matter of course, and for which we fight here in the Council of Europe. This report documents history and recalls that it is being repeated with a similar plan, that is, the targeted eradication of the culture of another country, of the cultural heritage, of the destruction of essential infrastructure, of energy sources, water catchments, the mining of cornfields, the attacks on the civil population and abduction of people. Never again. That is the watchword of this report. It's a matter of avoiding any repetition of these crimes against humanity. Never again. That was the watchword after the Second World War. And if today in Europe Jewish children no longer dare go to school, or if in the streets of the West people call for the imposition of the Sharia law, we have failed. Let's stand up against distortion and propaganda. They are the weapons of demagogues and dictatorships. Let's stand up for freedom and international law. They are our weapons. And as I speak, both of these are being defended in Ukraine.
Thank you. And may I now call Ms. Olenia Mosenets from Ukraine.
Dear colleagues, we thank Mr. Abraham for his excellent report. Hungry eyes, pale faces, cold, thin hands, and the same questions. Do you have any bread? These words of Ukrainian journalist Nadia Sukharukova, who together with her family survived the occupation of Mariupol by Russian troops. She writes that people in Mariupol did not have food, were dying of hunger, and cried with happiness when they received the first piece of bread after the occupation. Those who survived cried, but many Ukrainians died from Russian bombs and starvation. There are thousands of such testimonies, and this is real genocide of Ukrainians. But the Russians have not invented anything new. The totalitarian regime has already killed Ukrainians through starvation. More than 90 years ago, Moscow committed genocide against the Ukrainian people by organizing the artificial hunger. The destruction of the political and cultural Ukrainian elite and then of millions of peasants who form the backbone of the Ukrainian nation was meant to be genocide. The Soviet regime organized it through total confiscation of food, blockade and terror. Ukraine lost between 4 and 10 million human lives as a result of Holodomor. We thank the parliament and governments of the countries that have recognized the Holodomor as genocide of Ukrainian people. We are also grateful for the recognition of Holodomor as a genocide by international organizations, PACE, the European Parliament, the OSCE, the UN Human Rights Council, and others. However, today the genocide has returned to our land, brought by Russian troops who once again want to destroy the Ukrainian nation. To do this, the occupiers killed and deport, destroy cities, and steal our grain. They do not hesitate to boast about stealing grain from the occupied territories of Ukraine. Since 2022, Russia and its partners have sold nearly $1 billion worth of grain stolen from Ukraine. As the reporter correctly pointed out, the deportation of tens of thousands of Ukrainian children can also be an element of genocide. The information campaigns of the Holodomor and the current Russian aggression are very similar. Both then and now, the occupiers are trying to hide crimes and create an artificial reality far from real reality. Statements made at the highest level of the Russian Federation deny the very right of the Ukrainian people to exist as an independent nation. I agree with the speakers that today we cannot bring the perpetrators of the Holodomor to justice. They are dead. Therefore, there really should be a court of history that will establish and preserve for future generations the true facts about the Holodomor genocide and their legal status. I support the conclusions of the Assembly and call on all national parliaments that have not yet done so to recognize the Holodomor as genocide of the Ukrainian people, and on governments to do everything possible to help the people of Ukraine fight off on the ongoing genocidal attacks by the Russians and bring to justice those responsible for the crimes of genocide and war crimes committed by Russians against Ukrainians. Never again. Thank you.
Thank you, Ma'am. I now call Ms. Belén Hoyo of Spain.
Sí, muchas gracias.
Many thanks, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, when I began to be able to think about things and to be aware of our history, I thought that future generations would never suffer the same horrors that our grandfathers did. But unfortunately, I was wrong. Today, I shall attempt to explain to my daughters the horrible pictures that come to us from other parts of Europe and the Middle East. And sometimes I don't have words for this. I don't have words because I cannot manage myself to understand how, in this century, with theoretically the most advanced society that the world has ever known, we can find ourselves dealing with the horrors and the most bloody violence that we are actually seeing. I don't want to try to imagine what you are living in the first person in these wars and in these situations, and how you can possibly explain to yourselves to your children, what is happening around you. And so I'm wondering now if the years of peace that we lived through were just a brief one-off phenomenon, and whether it's not human nature which always ends up in situations of violence and cruelty. I would like to believe that that is not so. However, in the complicated times that we are living in, I think that it is of basic importance to have this assembly to guarantee freedom and peace and human rights. Justice, to pay honor to the victims of the Holodomor. Stalin's regime carried out massacre of the Ukrainian population to deprive them of food and have them die in the most inhuman way. And its authors must pay for this and must be judged, just as Putin must be judged and his whole regime must be judged for carrying out another genocide today. I don't want to conclude, Mr. President, without thanking all the members of Parliament from Ukraine and all the different political parties represented here today, who, in spite of everything they're experiencing day upon day, the complicated situation that they have to live in their homeland, in their own homes, come here, plenary after plenary, to share with us the things that they are experiencing and to share with us their experience and to be able to put their foot on their home ground once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Ma'am. And may I now call Mr. Yuri Kamelchuk. Yuri.
Dear Chairman, dear colleagues, I also have my own story from Holodomor. My mother's family house was destroyed by Russians in Volyn region because they tried to establish some kolkhoz, if you know what it is, collective farm. During the Holodomor, the Soviet Kremlin authorities created collective farms. People were driven there to work. People didn't have the right to keep cows. They were driven to collective farms to give milk for dairy factories. And people didn't have time to cultivate their fields, or these fields were simply taken from them. For a few ears of wheat, they could be sent to Siberia or shot. 90 years ago, the genocide was aimed at exterminating millions of innocent Ukrainians through an artificially created famine caused by the Soviet regime. The Holodomor was not just a tragedy, but a deliberate political campaign aimed at breaking the national identity of Ukrainians and suppressing their desire for freedom. We have no right to forget these terrible lessons of history. Today, Ukraine is once again on the verge of such a threat. Russian aggression against our country is not just a war, it's an attempt to destroy the Ukrainian people, our culture, our language, our right to exist. Russia is waging war not only on the battlefield, but also through targeted attacks on civilian infrastructure, appropriate and pass off as one's own. Therefore, we must stop them with real effective sanctions, real means of air defense, and destroy their means of war on the territory of Russia. There is no need to be afraid of mad beast. It must be destroyed. Millions of people of enslaved nations in Russia are waiting for adult and strong decisions from the world. Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, Caucasus Emirate, Ingushetia, North Ossetia, Kabardino-Balkaria, Karachay-Cherkessia, Adygea, Kalmykia, Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, Chuvashia, Mordovia, Udmurtia, Mari El, Erzia, Buryatia, and others. Let's make Russia small again. Today, Ukraine is fighting not only for its independence, but also for those values that are fundamental for every democratic nation: the right to life, the right to freedom and dignity. I believe that the victory in Ukraine in the war with Imperial Russia will light up democratic movements and forever bury the totalitarian regimes of the world. Pass this resolution to the national parliaments, implement it, and never let it happen again anywhere in the world. Slava Ukraini!
Thank you, Yuri. A very fine way to end and conclude the list of speakers. I now call Lord Keane, Rapporteur, to reply. Lord Keane, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Colleagues, I would like to thank everyone who's contributed to this important debate. I would also like to express my thanks to all the members of the Legal Affairs and Human Rights Committee who gave such support to our rapporteur, Mr. Knut Abraham, in the preparation of his report. The rapporteur organized significant hearings with leading historians from Ukraine and Germany, and the committee also heard a detailed presentation by the Ukrainian Prosecutor General. The Prosecutor General presented evidence collected and analyzed meticulously from the newly declassified official files that I mentioned before. It was on this basis and in foundation upon solidly researched data that our committee was able to come to its conclusions. And these are summed up in the committee's draft resolution and explained in more detail in the report. I would like to stress one aspect which gives frightening new relevance to this report. This is not only a commemoration, however important, of a past crime, and however horrific it may have been. For now, as our committee and many colleagues this morning note, history is in the process of repeating itself. Russia is once again committing acts of genocide against the Ukrainian people. As chair of the Legal Affairs and Human Rights Committee, I wholeheartedly support our committee's draft, including the appeal to all our governments to give Ukraine the means to defend itself against the renewed attempt to compromise and destroy the integrity of that nation state. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Keane. The debate is now closed. The Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights has presented a draft resolution to which 7 amendments have been tabled. I remind you that speeches on amendments are limited to 30 seconds. Any amendment which has been unanimously approved by the committee seized for report shall not be put to the vote in the plenary and shall be declared as definitively approved unless 10 or more members of the Assembly object. I understand that the chairperson of the committee wishes to propose to the Assembly amendments 5, 7, 4, 3, 1 and 2 to the draft resolution which were unanimously approved to be declared as approved. Is that so, Lord Keane?
Chair, that is the position. All of those amendments are moved by me on behalf of the committee, and I confirm that all were unanimously approved by the committee, and I therefore invite the Assembly to pass those amendments.
Thank you, Lord Keane. If no one objects, I will consider the amendments to be approved. Is there an objection? No objections. Amendments 5, 7, 4, 3, 1 and 2 to the draft resolutions are therefore approved and will not be called. I understand that Ms. Maria Metzler-Fedorenko wishes to withdraw Amendment 6. Is that correct?
Yes, President, this is correct. We have agreed upon this with the committee.
Thank you, Maria. We understand that nobody wants to take up this amendment, so Amendment 6 is withdrawn. We will move on. We will now proceed to vote on the draft resolution contained in the document as amended. A simple majority is required. The vote is open. The vote is now closed. I call for the result to be displayed. It is unanimous.
So I think just a short pause until the President and the Minister are here, because the next item is an address, and we need them to arrive.
Okay, so I just...
They're due in a couple of minutes.
The Minister is due at 12 o'clock. We will now hear, when that happens, an address by Mr. Tymoshenko Muniski, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade of the Republic of North Macedonia.
Just waiting for
Now we can go with someone taking a list. I've got 2, maybe 3 from my delegation.
The sitting is open. I remind members that they should insert their badge before taking the floor. As you begin your speech, dear colleagues, please press the microphone button once only. The first item of business this morning is this debate of the report titled Commemorating...
No.
I'm sorry. Really sorry. Okay. It's not about a commemoration, about a hearing, and I have the opportunity to welcome in our assembly the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade of the Republic of North Macedonia, Mr. Tintsu Muksunski, and I will invite him immediately, since it is 12 o'clock, as you see, Mr. Minister, to take the floor and address our assembly, who is waiting for your speech. Then I just want to inform you that questions will be asked to you from the representatives of the 5 political groups and from parliamentarians. You may proceed. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Dear President of the Parliamentary Assembly, esteemed parliamentarians, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I am deeply honored to address this esteemed body, the oldest international parliamentary assembly here in the historic city of Strasbourg, symbolic of post-war European unity, reconciliation, and hope for justice and citizens across Europe. This year, we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Council of Europe, our beacon for human rights, democracy, and rule of law. Such milestones often make us forget the horrors of the past and take for granted the peace and cooperation we enjoy, thanks to the vision of European leaders who built this institution. It is our collective duty, politicians, diplomats, and international representatives, to safeguard and continuously improve this multilateral system. We must remain vigilant, using the tools and mechanisms developed over the years to address emerging threats, ensuring that armed conflicts are never the result of complacency or neglect. Sadly, the reality is that we are once again witnessing aggressive nationalism and a blatant disregard for international order. Europe faces a war of aggression against Ukraine, a fellow member state. This Assembly's political recommendation to expel Russia in 2022 was a necessary and just decision, reflecting our commitment to the values that we share. North Macedonia has stood firmly with Ukraine, joining solidarity efforts and aligning fully with the EU's common foreign and security policy, including sanctions on Russia. We endorsed the enlarged partial agreement on the register of damage caused by the aggression, hoping it will lead to compensation and accountability. In this context, we support the efforts to establish a compensation mechanism and a special tribunal on crimes of aggression. Additionally, we supported the action plan for Ukraine's recovery. While defense is crucial, diplomacy remains the key to achieving lasting peace grounded on international law and respect for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Allow me to commend my Lithuanian colleague, Gabrielius Landsbergis, current president of the Committee of Ministers, for his leadership in advancing critical priorities. Besides the unrelenting support to Ukraine, the abolition of the death penalty, gender equality, combating violence against women, freedom of expression, combating disinformation, hate speech, and corruption. The Republic of North Macedonia shares these values and is committed to promoting them in the Human Rights Council if elected for 2025 to 2027. We also will continue to work closely with the future Council of Ministers presidencies in light of our own upcoming chairmanship with the Council of Ministers in November 2027. I would like to extend my gratitude to the previous Secretary General, Ms. Pejcinovic-Buric, and wish every success to Alain Berset, who pledged to foster the culture of dialogue, consensus building, and relations between the Council of Europe and other international organizations, especially its closest strategic partner, the European Union. Ladies and gentlemen, the Fourth Council of Europe Summit in Reykjavik reinforced our unity and commitment to our core principles. We now have the Reykjavik Declaration to guide us and a real growth budget to implement it. We particularly value the adoption of the principles for democracy to address the democratic backsliding and a renewed focus on strengthening the Court of Human Rights and ensuring the execution of its judgments. As we face complex challenges ahead, democratic backsliding, extremism, climate change, and new technologies, the Council of Europe must continue to play a pivotal role. These issues all have a human rights dimension, and for this we need strong internal cohesion within the organization. Furthermore, it is crucial not to be silent when fundamental values are threatened if we want to keep the political relevance of our organization. It is both an honor and responsibility to stand before you today to reflect on a matter that strikes at the very core of our shared European identity, our collective commitment to human rights, the rule of law, and the integrity of the institutions that safeguard them. At the heart of this commitment lies the European Court of Human Rights, an institution that serves not merely as a court of last resort, but as the bedrock of justice and dignity for millions of our citizens. As former president of the court Shifra O'Leary said, the convention serves as an instrument of peace and a guardian of democracy and rule of law across Europe. My country, like every member state, has faced difficult moments when confronted with ECHR rulings that challenged us to do better. But in these moments, we have embraced these rulings not as an imposition, but as an opportunity to reaffirm our commitment to the values we all claim to uphold. Whether through legal reforms or sometimes confronting uncomfortable truths about our own systems, we have chosen the path of compliance, no matter how difficult. This is not simply a legal obligation, it is a moral imperative. However, there is a growing tendency in part of our region to view ECHR rulings as suggestions rather than binding judgments. This undermines the very foundations of our human rights architecture and risks eroding the credibility of our institutions. When countries delay or refuse to implement these rulings, particularly when they concern the rights of minorities or vulnerable groups, they send a very dangerous message that some rights are negotiable and that justice can be deferred indefinitely. We reject this notion. We have chosen to act when faced with ECHR judgments, even when those decisions required us to make hard choices and to address deep-seated issues. We understand that true democracy is not just about the will of the majority, but about the protection of every individual's rights, no matter how small or marginalized that voice may be. It is easy to abide by the law when it is convenient, but it is in moments of discomfort and difficulty that our commitment to the rule of law is truly tested. I firmly urge all of us, especially in our region, to reflect on this reality. failing to implement ECHR decisions not only harms the individuals or groups whose rights are at stake, it weakens our standing as democratic nations. It tells the world we pick and choose when to honor the institutions we have pledged to respect. This, I believe, is a far greater threat to our unity and our future than any political discomfort that may arise from implementing difficult rulings. My nation is by no means perfect, but we have made a choice to do better, to uphold the standards of justice that this body stands for. I call upon all of us to do the same for the credibility of our shared values, for the dignity of our citizens, and for the future of Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, let me turn to the Western Balkans and our EU integration. First, I would like to thank this Assembly for its reinforced commitment over the last few years to our EU integration and the support of the Council of Europe in that process. I have just returned from the Berlin Process Ministerial meeting, marking its 10th anniversary. The Berlin Process has been essential in driving cooperation and reform in the region. But despite these efforts, the path to EU membership remains long and fraught with delays. Next year, my nation will mark 30 years of membership in the Council of Europe. While this milestone reflects the steady progress our nation has made towards democratic change and integration with European values, we also face another more sobering anniversary. It will be 20 years since the European Council granted us the status of an official EU candidate country. 20 years of waiting, of hoping, and of striving to prove ourselves worthy of full EU membership. Yet, despite all the efforts, reforms, and sacrifices, our path to EU membership remains obstructed by obstacles that feel increasingly unjust. The process has become heavily politicized, and the goalposts seem to shift just as we approach them. Our journey has been marked by vetoes imposed by more powerful neighbors, using their influence to shape the narrative in ways that do not reflect fairness or mutual respect. The promise of integration has at times been dangled before us, only to be withdrawn under the weight of geopolitical interest and domestic considerations within the EU itself. This has not only tested the resilience of our institutions, but also the patience of our people. Imagine the disillusionment of a nation that has done everything asked of it, only to be told that the goal is still out of reach. How do you maintain hope when you feel that the very principles that the European Union stands for, solidarity, justice, and unity, are being applied unequally? We have endured profound injustices on this journey. We have navigated name changes, identity debates, and historical disputes, all to meet the demands set before us. And while many will tell us not to regret making these compromises for the sake of peace and progress, we cannot ignore the emotional toll it has taken on our nation. The sense of betrayal runs deep, especially when our sincere efforts to align with European standards are met with further delays and uncertainty. But despite this, we refuse to give in to despair. We will not allow these justices to fuel Euroscepticism or narratives of victimhood. Instead, we will continue to fight for our rightful place in Europe, driven by the belief that justice will ultimately prevail. The path may be long, but we remain committed to the values that Europe represents. And we will keep pushing for a process that is fair, transparent, and based on mutual respect. In the words of Václav Havel, Hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out. For us, belonging to the EU simply makes sense, and we are determined to see this journey through, no matter the obstacles we face. Thank you for your attention.
Before I give the floor to colleagues, dear Minister, allow me to remind my colleagues that you have been appointed since last June this year as a Minister of Foreign Affairs, but you are very experienced, and you have also been experienced as a local elected representatives. And that brings in my mind this very famous American phrase that all politics is local. And the Americans explain it because they say that local refers to the fact that politicians need local skills to succeed. So I know that you have a lot of experience, though you're very young. I want to welcome you once again to this assembly, and I now give the floor to my parliamentarian colleagues to ask you questions. As you know, the procedure goes with questions addressed first to you from the parties. On behalf of the Socialists, Greens and Democrats, it is Anna Kristina Mikkonen who has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Minister, of your review. Having in mind the statements made by your Vice Prime Minister Nikolovsky on Bulgaria, the reaction of the Greek authorities on your negation of the Prespa Agreement, and in line of the recent decisions to separate Albania from North Macedonia on the EU accession path, is your government sincere in making North Macedonia a full EU member state?
Mr. Minister, would you like to respond?
Hello, thank you for your question. I am a firm believer that sincerity is proven through action. We have had many governments in the past who have said that they are committed to the EU path, but we need to start practicing what we preach. And as the President of the Parliamentary Assembly mentioned, I myself am a former mayor and very deeply understand that citizens believe in tangible results, not just good words and political promises. So let me tell you in the last 3 months what we as a government have done to prove that we are committed to the values of the European Union. First, as I mentioned in my speech, we have remained 100% aligned with the EU's common and foreign security policy. Second, we have remained principled in our support for Ukraine, support which I just recently reiterated with my wonderful new Ukrainian colleague in New York, but support that is not just political, but that is very tangible on the ground. Third, our government managed within the first 2 months to adopt the reform agenda. The reform agenda which opens our nation to the EU's growth plan, which we see as fundamental in advancing on the path towards the European Union. We are prepared for the difficult reforms, and we will do the difficult reforms together with the European Union. But on the other hand, that is the European Union that I believe in. The European Union based on a coherent common foreign and security policy. A European Union based on the acquis communautaire. I do not believe in a European Union that allows bilateralization on the basis of subjective criteria on the path towards EU membership. Our government will be honest, not just with the EU institutions, but with all of the member states who we see as our allies. We see international public law as a fundament of our foreign policy. I myself, being a professor of Roman law, teach students about a principle called pacta sunt servanda. Agreements must be kept. And that is how we will behave with all of our neighbors. Sometimes we might not be happy about these agreements. Sometimes we might disagree with the substance of them. But it is essential to the world in which we want to live that we uphold international public law. And in that sense, that is my answer to you in relation to the bilateral relationship with our neighbors. But we also expect this of our neighbors as well, to also upkeep their obligations under ratified, signed international agreements that we have between each other, even those that are of a bilateral nature. I believe in values. I believe that you, like me, are a member of a younger generation of politicians. And we have an obligation to uphold traditional values, but also an obligation to understand that younger generations want quick results from us, quick results that bring us closer together. I believe that we are all European. I also believe that as a nation we have many more things that we need to do before we get to the process of EU membership. But I also, as I argumented in my speech, fundamentally believe that not this year. Many, many years ago, we deserved at least to have opened accession negotiations, and I will stand principled in that view.
Thank you, Minister. On behalf of the EPP Group, Ioannis Economou.
Mr. President, welcome, Mr. Minister, and thank you for your speech. I suppose you agree that the respecting of the European acquis and also the international agreements, such as PRESPA agreements, particularly regarding in core provisions such as the name or the Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation with Bulgaria, are not only bilateral issues, but also fundamental conditions for the European integration of the West Balkan countries, includes, of course, North Macedonia, a process that EPP strongly supports. So my question is, what actions will you take to ensure that the PRESPA agreement is fully respected and to fulfill your obligations towards the European Union, complying with all international agreements you have?
Thank you, Mr. Economou. Mr. Minister, would you like to respond?
Thank you for your question. I believe, as I said, that we must adhere to the values that we speak about in this room. And in that sense, one of the issues that I reaffirmed only a few days ago with my Greek colleague in New York is that as much as politically, as individuals, discerning ourselves from our current political functions, we might not like the PRESPA agreement, under international public law, we are obliged by it. But that obligation is for both sides. Many things both sides can do better, not just when it comes to the PRESPA agreement, to the bilateral relationship. When it comes both to Greece and Bulgaria, more should unite us than what divides us. And I think if we have goodwill, if we have understanding, then tangibly moving forward on the things that change citizens' lives, we will also upkeep our obligations under international public law. But as I also remember very well, the PRESPA agreement had certain preconditions that allowed for our nation to become a member of NATO. Such preconditions exist in the Good Neighborly Treaty with Bulgaria, in which Bulgaria obligates itself to not impede us on our path towards the European Union, quite to the contrary, in writing obligates it to help us. I, to this day, cannot understand and will not understand how debates on history, language, identity can be an impediment of this nature, not on the basis of facts, but on the basis of subjective criteria. What I can promise you is that my government will show goodwill. We will show patience. We want excellent relationship with all of our neighbors, and we believe relationships are not just political, but they are based on issues such as trade, energy, infrastructure. What unites us with Greece is a necessity for enhancing the infrastructure in Corridor 10. What unites us with Bulgaria is the necessity for investments, further investments in the infrastructure on Corridor 8. And these are priorities of our government. We have challenges in the issues of energy. We have done so much good work together with both of these countries in collaboration between educations of higher institution. Why do we allow day-to-day politics to be an impediment to our bilateral relationships? To this day, I cannot understand. And that is why I may sometimes be unconventional, but what I will commit to you is that in all of the challenges, in all of the issues that we will face, our government, our new government, will approach them in a positive manner and in a manner which aims to find a solution rather than to create further problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. On behalf of the European Conservatives, Dmytro Natalouka.
Thank you very much, dear Minister, dear President. Thank you for your speech. And as a Ukrainian, let me thank you also for the firm support North Macedonia is providing for Ukraine. But as a member of the Conservatives group, you are a center-right government, which we share very much the values of. And you're also a member of the NATO. And to be honest, the Balkans and the region is a complex one. So my question would be to you, how would you, in a way, see North Macedonia contributing to the regional security and stability, and how will you balance this security cooperation with the domestic concerns that the region definitely has? Thank you.
Thank you, Dmytro. Minister, would you like to respond?
First of all, I apologize for not facing you directly when speaking to you, but I cannot be faced at the microphone in this sense. We will continue to support your nation because your nation is fighting a principled battle. And I say a battle of values, a battle of ideals, but I will repeat again and again, a battle that is related to upkeeping international public law. And this, I view, in light of our foreign policy priorities, is especially a key issue for small and landlocked nations. We believe that we need to remain a reliable partner of NATO. And that is why we will not only retain at least 2% spending of GDP on our defense budget, but we will go above and beyond. And I have even publicly said we are willing to support calls for even raising that threshold if necessary. Not from an offensive aspect, from a defense and deterrence aspect. The Western Balkans is a region that sadly has been known for its political volatility. And I do understand the risks that are associated with this political volatility. That is why we need diplomacy, we need understanding, and we need, as politicians, and I say this especially as a young politician, to affirm that the path forward is the European path. The path forward is adhering to the highest standards of the European Union, but the path forward is also cultivating a culture of dialogue between ourselves. I think that is something that lacks very much. And as I said on the answer to one of the previous questions, it is very easy to find issues that divide us. I am sad that that has been practice in our region in the past. Let's start talking about what unites us. And what concretely unites us, as I mentioned previously, and that is also related to the issue of security, as you asked, is challenges related to energy, challenges related to food security, challenges related to enhancing our infrastructure so that it is better prepared to anticipate security challenges for the future. And in that sense, we as a government have offered many tangible ideas moving forward, and we hope to cooperate on an equal basis with not just our immediate neighborhood, our wider neighborhood, to move our continent forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. On behalf of ALDE, Mariana Puljak.
Thank you, dear Mr. Minister, for your speech. First, let me express in front of European liberals support for North Macedonian EU integration. Since the election, your government has emphasized continuing this process without bilateral issues, as Macedonians citizens are really frustrated, and I might say something that we, coming from Croatia, we Croatians understand very well. Last week, your Prime Minister suggested that if integration must follow the EU Council conclusions, the response would be ne blagodaram, or no thank you. Given the geopolitical context, can you afford to delay the process, and how can we help in your issues and your dialogue with your neighbors? Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana. Mr. Minister, would you like to respond?
First of all, thank you for your support. In many ways, we started our path towards the EU membership together. I was in Zagreb, and to this day, remember the video of Prime Minister Plenković, President of the European Commission, Ms. von der Leyen, sitting in the wonderful Kraš Cafe on Trg Ban Jeličić, and as they ordered their coffee, the bill came, Mr. Plenković took out euro bills and paid. That same day, together with my family, we crossed the border between Croatia and Slovenia. No passport was necessary. We started the path together. You are now a member of Schengen. You use the euro as your national currency. We are still waiting to open accession negotiations. Is that fair and merit-based? I will leave it at a question. You can come to the conclusions yourself. The practice of bilateralization of any nation's EU path has created unseen precedents and has harmed perception about the EU's enlargement policy. That is a reality that we have to face. The practice that is being set with the Macedonian case is prime example. Our Prime Minister has said, on the basis of merit and on the basis of harmonization with the acquis, we will accept all of the arguments. We have so much more to do. We know that and we understand that. But to impede us on our path because of subjective issues that are not related to a reality is unfair, unjust, and not in line with the standards of the European Union itself. We are ready to speak with our neighbors. We are ready to resolve challenges, but please not challenges that are political. Rhetoric can mean a lot of things. Let us speak about objective issues. Let us speak about, as I mentioned in my speech, decisions of the European Court of Human Rights. That is an objective criteria. That is the highest, I personally believe, the court that sets the highest global standards in terms of application of human rights. On the basis of these issues, we will discuss and we will move forward. What the EU needs, in our view, is a resilient approach, and to understand that in light, as you mentioned, of these geopolitical circumstances, it is necessary to move all of the countries of the Western Balkans forward so that malign actors, even in our region, don't point a finger and say, why would you trust the EU? Look at what they're doing to the Macedonians. On the basis of criteria, we are willing to discuss, debate, and move forward because we as a government, as I said, through tangible things that we have done, through tangible policies that we have implemented, believe that there is truly no better path than full EU membership.
Thank you, Minister. On behalf of United European Left, Berdan Öztürk.
Thank you. Dear Minister, recalling the 2023 conference held in Skopje regarding the inter-parliamentary dialogue for further promotion of European integration into Western Balkans, it seems that recent developments may slow down EU accession of North Macedonia due to the whole complexity of the region. We know that if things don't go well in one country, it may easily spill over onto others. How do you see the current opportunities and dangers for the region and the role of North Macedonia in maintaining this stability? Thank you.
Thank you, Berdan. Dear Minister, would you like to respond?
We as a government have argued that our stance to be firm on de-bilateralization, primarily, first of all, to be very honest with you, protects us as a nation, but from a second perspective, also protects the EU enlarged policy as a composite policy in its fundamentals. So in that sense, I say we need to push forward a merit-based approach. Do I believe that there are risks in the regions? I believe there are factors who want to cause risk, and there are factors who want to destabilize the region in which we live. But we as a collective society, who in huge majorities believe in the values that we're speaking about today, need to work together. If we sit down and we have an honest approach between each other, then I believe that the path forward is inevitable. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Now I will give the floor to colleagues in the group of three, and you will reply to the three first afterwards. Mr. Piero Fassino is next.
Well, I want to speak about the enlargement of the European Union process and the delays therein. Thank you. Like you, I regret the fact there have been two lengthy delays in this process, but I think that to avoid making them even longer, there's a need to avoid fueling new crises and points of conflict. So I'd like to ask you a very direct question. You belong to a party which, in opposition, challenged the agreement on the name North Macedonia and contested the Prespa Agreement. Now that you are in government and the foreign minister, will you respect those agreements, or will you call them into question? Will you respect them? Calling them into question, I believe, means fueling other further conflicts and a delay in the accession of North Macedonia to the European Union.
Mr. President, dear Mr. Minister, congratulations for your election. I'm one of the member of the monitoring committee, the rapporteur. So can you tell us something about the state of relation with Bulgaria and the situation with Corridor 8, please? And it is known that you are receiving $500 million from Mr. Orban without clear conditions. How will you implement this money? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sybil. Sara Sofia Siren is next. It looks like she's not present, so I'm going to Georg Georgiev.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Minister, dear neighbor. Regardless of the ongoing unfounded and negative rhetoric against my country, Bulgaria supports the integration of the Western Balkans, including the Republic of North Macedonia, based on the agreed European compromise. In the context of the extraordinary challenges in front of us, and above all, Russia's war in Ukraine, the full EU integration of the Western Balkans is a must. This process should also lead to the full respect of the EU decisions and the Council of Europe values and standards. In this regard, when your country will fulfill the European decision from the 2022, which clearly outlines the steps to achieve European integration, amend your constitution as it was agreed between the Republic of North Macedonia government and the EU, and include the Bulgarians in the constitution.
Thank you, Georg. Mr. Minister, would you like to respond?
To the first question, as I previously mentioned, not just my political party, but I personally, as an individual, and I abstract myself from my political position, believe that the Prespa Agreement has many flaws. But in my political position, I understand that there is a political and legal reality that stems from respecting international public law. And I would be contradictory to the values that I teach to students at university, but also contradictory to the values that I must uphold as a lawyer, if I say that I will not respect the principle of pacta sunt servanda. But to add to that, I also expect that from all of our neighbors, when they have to also implement certain aspects of not just the Prespa Agreement, but other international agreements, including the Good Neighborly Treaty that we have signed with Bulgaria. If we all uphold international public law, then there would be no space for this debate that we have right now. My nation would currently be at least negotiating with EU membership. Sadly, some have chosen to defy it, but again, with positive energy, with cultivating an aura of positivity, we will find solutions to all the challenges before us. When it comes to Corridor 8 is a key strategic infrastructure priority of our government together with Corridor 10. But that also means getting Corridor 8 done. Because if Corridor 8 stops at the border of my country, then it is not functional, especially when it comes to the railway infrastructure. That is why we have chosen to open dialogue, especially with our neighbor Bulgaria, to find a way that the project in Corridor 8 gets done. Because we are a government that believes in getting things done. Not just speaking about things, but getting projects efficiently done. So what I can tell you, as with Corridor 8, which we see as very important, we also fundamentally believe in Corridor 8. I believe your question was, when it comes to the loan coming from Hungary, an EU member nation currently presiding with the European Union and a member of NATO and a key ally in NATO, not just of us, but of all our other members, how the government will use the money. The 500 million euro loan coming will be used for two primary issues. 250 million euros used will be used for CapEx projects going directly to municipalities. As the President said, being a previous mayor, I also truly believe that projects in local government, new kindergartens, new schools, new roads, new waste management projects are projects that change people's lives. Half of those finances will be going there. The second half will be going directly to business. We inherited as a government a horrible financial situation. The fiscal aspect, the fiscal policy of the government was devastated. And that is why we believe we need to take specific steps, a better taxation policy, lowering taxes, but also giving money to business, giving money to entrepreneurs, so that we stimulate the domestic economy and we finally start to create some growth. I thank my Bulgarian colleague for his comment. And I would say, let's start talking about what unites us. Let's start talking about what we can do together. Let's move forward on the EU path, because after our country, nobody has a bigger interest in us becoming an EU member state than our neighbors. We will reap the highest benefits. But after that, Bulgaria, Greece, Albania, Kosovo, Serbia will also reap higher benefits from this membership. There are many things that can move us backward. I do not know of a case of the Bulgarian minority being harmed in our country, but if you know a case, then let's speak together. Let's work institutionally. Let's work to advance the rights of minorities in both countries, understanding the different constitutional systems that we have. You give us examples of what we can do better, but we can also give you examples of what you can do better when it comes to implementing the decisions of the ECHR. Here we are a model country. If we work together, by example, with continuity in our models of governance, then we will advance our region forward. We are young generations in politics. We can look back at the histories of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. But let's talk about the 21st century. Let's talk about artificial intelligence. Let's talk about trade. Let's talk about the huge tourism potential that exists between the two countries. All of our neighbors are our friends, and we will behave in that way. But help us so that we can help you. Let's move the region forward towards the EU membership. Our path will not be easy, but if we respect the agreements that we have achieved, such as obligations for you to help us move forward, in light of the Good Neighborly Treaty, then without a doubt, there is a European future for the whole region.
Thank you, Minister. Ariana Mousliousosi is next. Is Ariana in the hemicycle? Now I'm going to Elvira Kovacs. So next is Yuri Kamelchuk.
Yes, it is. Once again, I'm sorry, I don't know what is happening. North Macedonia provided Ukraine with military aid totaling 16% of its annual defense budget. Thank you for 4 Su-25 aircraft, 31 T-72 tanks, and Mi-24 helicopters. Thank you also for joining to the G7 declaration in support of security guarantees for Ukraine and shelters for thousands of Ukrainians. Also, I want to thank you for the successful training of the first group of Ukrainian servicemen at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And I would like to say that your path to the EU has accelerated, and now North Macedonia and Ukraine, due to Russian aggression, are on the same road to the European family. Ukraine will always remember your help and invites you to join reconstruction after our victory. And my question, what are you thinking? What can make Europe even more courageous and determined against Russia?
Thank you, Yuri. Next is Nadezhda Yordanova.
Thank you, President. Mr. Minister, hate-motivated violence is one of the grave challenges that the Council of Europe persistently fights against, as it threatens the very core value of our shared values. In view of those efforts, what measures does your government take to pursue the recommendations of the 6th ECRI report on North Macedonia, such as effective investigations and holding perpetrators accountable for hate-motivated violence, and for taking a strong public stance condemning all forms of violence against persons self-identifying as ethnic Bulgarians or their organizations?
Thank you, Nadezhda. Tosko Yordanov is next.
Thank you, President. Minister, as you know, our position as the European Union on the possibility of a renegotiation is more than clear, crystal clear. So, Mr. Mutsunski, when can we expect North Macedonia to include the Bulgarians in its constitution?
Mr. Minister, would you like to respond?
Thank you. When it comes to Ukraine, we pride ourselves in being one of the nations that per capita is one of the 5 biggest supporters coming from the NATO member states. And we think there's even more we can do. There's discussions with your current government. Although we are a small nation, we are big at heart. And in the past, we remember how Ukraine has also been a supporter of ours on this path moving forward. We are speaking right now about establishing the strategic partnership that is also very key between the two countries. We will be seeing President Zelensky in just a few days. He will be in Dubrovnik, meeting with the leaders from our region, where we will reaffirm our support for Ukraine. I will be there accompanying Prime Minister Christian Mickoski. When it comes to the rights of the Bulgarian minority in our country, for many things, my country has its faults. Reform of rule of law, anti-corruption, there's so much more we can do. But if we do something right, then it is minority rights. I like to say that we go even above and beyond the highest European standards. But as we have spoken in the past, nobody is perfect. But we have established institutional systems, both administrative and judicial, that deal with these issues. And I believe that not a single case in the past has allowed our nation to be viewed as a negative model in this sense. As I said, we have learned many of our practices through the case law of the ECHR. There have been isolated cases which have been solved. There are cases which are in process, but the ECHR has been helpful in helping us to learn how to do things better. I hope that that type of case law begins to be applied by all of the members of the Council of Europe. Then only will we be successful. When it comes to the question of constitutional changes, we believe that the issue of constitutional changes has another context, and that is, how many more constitutional changes does my nation have to do to move forward on the path towards the EU membership? Can somebody guarantee us that this will be the last constitutional change that somebody will request from us to become a full member of the EU? And may I point out, a constitutional change that has nothing to do with EU criteria for membership, that stems from both the Copenhagen criteria, the Madrid criteria, and the EU's acquis communautaire. We are prepared to speak with our neighbor, as we've said extremely publicly, about how to move forward on these constitutional changes on the basis of reciprocity, on the basis of mutual understanding. We hope for a positive and democratic outcome in the elections that will take place in Bulgaria. And after these elections finish, we will, of course, proactively speak, engage, not just on this issue, but as I said, on the abundant number of issues that unite us, together with the Bulgarian government, because we believe that as a region, not only do we have a common future, but we also have common obligations towards one another.
Thank you, Minister. It looks like you are very quick, and we have time for the 3 remaining questions. First is Gustav Gethberg.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Foreign Minister, and welcome also to the hemicycle of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. And thank you for your speech and for your answers. North Macedonia is a valuable ally to my country, and as you mentioned, 30 years since you joined the Council of Europe, we joined NATO, becoming full-fledged allies this very March this year. So now we're fully together. Your path to further European integration is of importance to both you and us. You have talked about this very eloquently, that the hopes are high and so are the expectations when it comes on your path towards European integration. So my question is, how can you use the experiences of your membership of this body and of NATO as you enhance on further European integration?
Thank you, Gustav. Danica Saceva is next. Have you inserted your badge?
Yes, here. Mr. Minister, trans-border infrastructure is essential for regional stability and good neighborhood relations. You mentioned in your speech that citizens expect tangible results, so are your neighbors. So please focus on what unites us and tell us what is the timeline of the government of Skopje to complete the missing part of infrastructure of corridor number 8. Thank you.
Thank you, Danica. Armagan Gatsandan is the last one. So, since he's not here, Mr. Minister, would you like to respond?
Yes. First of all, congratulations to Sweden, who is now a valued member of NATO. And together, I think there's so much we can do. And I know that in the ideology of certain political parties, this was a commitment that was there many years before it even happened. And I believe that it is the right decision. And you had our support, and now our support is mutual because we are allies together in NATO. I think what we can learn from both membership in the Council of Europe and NATO is various different perspectives when it comes to implementing the highest standards of human rights, but from NATO, that security and defense perspective, which is especially coming to the forefront right now in the way the EU is modernizing itself. So I think that by being members of both the Council of Europe and NATO, we are fundamentally better prepared for going forwards towards full EU membership. And not only that, but the EU, when we do become a full member, will have a well-prepared member and a member that is a reliable partner, especially in the implementation of human rights, but also from the defense and security perspective. I thank the Bulgarian colleague for her question, and to be very open with you, I am extremely happy that so many colleagues from Bulgaria engaged and asked so many questions. To me, this is a pleasure, because it shows that you stayed here for my speech and you are also committed to our common future. Our common future does include Corridor 8 from both sides. I do not ask questions, you ask questions because you are a parliamentarian. I have the privilege of giving answers. Being a former parliamentarian as well, I know that the two sides have different obligations in this process. So what I will say is that together, with the facilitation of the European Union, we are currently engaged with Bulgaria. And the answer to that question should be that we will solve this together. We signed a crucial agreement between the Corridor 8 countries at the NATO summit in Washington. We saw just a few days ago how the United Kingdom was the first country that implemented that agreement. And that is why I say Corridor 8, the answer should be posed hopefully to me and my Bulgarian colleague. When will you finish this together? Because for Corridor 8, especially the railway aspect of it to be functional, it needs to be finished on both sides of the border. But as I said again, a huge thank you for all of your questions, the privilege to answer them, and it is my hope that this is just the first of our many engagements on the common issues, as we all, I hope, agree today, many more that unite us than those that divide us.
Mr. Minister, before I close the sitting, allow me to pinpoint two phrases out of your speech and the responses you gave to questions. I took some notes. You have talked about the European perspective of the Western Balkans. This, dear Minister, is a high priority for the Council of Europe, and I'm sure you're aware that this Assembly has implemented the subcommittee under this task. The second phrase that I wish to pinpoint is the Latin expression you used twice, pacta sunt servanda. Agreements should be respected. And I don't only like this phrase because I was taught Latin at school, which at that time, I have to admit, was a bit boring. It is because of the real meaning of the phrase you already, as I said, repeated twice, and shows your will and your country's will to serve the European dream, which is ideals commonly decided and equally respected. Thank you so much for being with us today. Dear colleagues, public sitting is this afternoon, 4:00 p.m. with the agenda approved on Monday. The sitting is now adjourned.